The reason that Metaphor ReFantazio is working so well, has been reviewing so well, is because it is not, in fact, a random thing, a thing that Atlus would not know how to make, but in fact, it is built on the foundation of the games that Atlus has made before. To a lot of people, this sounds undaring. It sounds like it's not challenging enough. It sounds like they're not innovating enough. If that was true, if that was honestly the case, Chrono Trigger would also be an uninspiring game that just reused a whole ton of Final Fantasy stuff and just added a couple of new things and ultimately wasn't that different. But no one would ever say that Chrono Trigger was uninspiring. No one would ever say, oh, Chrono Trigger, that's just another Final Fantasy. Oh, great. Who wanted that? No one would say those things. It would reveal how stupid you are. It would reveal that, oh, that's not a good take. Actually, Chrono Trigger is one of the greatest games of all time. But if you actually look at Chrono Trigger, chat, if you actually go at Chrono Trigger, very iterative of other Super Nintendo Final Fantasy games. It is built of Final Fantasy. It uses a world map. It uses ATB. It uses all these things from Final Fantasy and it puts its own spin on it, right? Like the way you have the fights on the actual map versus having those fights like in a separate battle screen. The core foundation of Final Fantasy's DNA and the Squaresoft DNA is found within Chrono Trigger, a title that is still ambitious and widely loved, seen as innovative, even though it is technically built off of everything those developers have been doing before. They have a specific craft, a type of game that they like to make, and in doing so, they're able to continue to make that style of game drastically different new directions that can almost make it feel like it's a brand new IP. There is not a universe out there where Chrono Trigger happened and Final Fantasy didn't, because Chrono Trigger is built off of Final Fantasy in an intimate way. It is the type of game that Squaresoft made, and they got better and better at doing it. Metaphor ReFantazio is the same way. They know how to make SMT games, knows how to make Persona games. It's not uninspiring. It's the type of game that they like to make. It's the genre that they have really crafted and innovated. The calendar system game is theirs, and they're the best at doing it. And so they keep making that specific type of game. Correct, Dario. They're not repetitive. They're iterative. And they take that formula and they put it in different settings and they add new mechanics and they swap those mechanics around and they do different things with them such that Metaphor still feels fresh, that it's not just a medieval coat with that Persona 6 presumptively is wearing. It's not that. It's a brand new IP that is built off the type of game that they like making. Before we continue, how would you like to win a free game of your choice? That's exactly what our sponsor Instant Gaming is allowing us to do. All you gotta do is click the link in the description or pinned comment below and then just click this giant orange participate button here. Instant Gaming gets all of their codes from authorized code resellers, meaning they're able to offer you games at a much cheaper price than you normally find them. For example, if you want to play Final Fantasy 16 on PC, normally you'd have to pay the whole $50. But if you get it through Instant Gaming, it's only $42.90. Instant Gaming, no pun intended, is an absolute game changer, so be sure to check them out and participate in our giveaway, win a free game, and take a look at all the games you could be saving so much money on. And Atlus is not the only one doing it. From Software, I've yet to see people say like, oh my god, I'm so sick of Soulsborne games. Maybe some of you are, but for the most part, people still really love FromSoft games. And each FromSoft game takes the Souls DNA and puts it in a different setting, controls a little bit differently than the last one, you know? Oh, you can jump in this one. Oh, you can parry with your gun in this one. They do something different with it each time. And because of that, they make it profoundly different and interesting somehow. It's built off all the previous FromSoft games, but they innovate on it and they take it somewhere new. Okay, well, some of you guys say you're tired of them. You're wrong. I'm not tired of them. So you're wrong. A lot of people aren't. I know some of you might be, but a lot of people still love FromSoft games. The thing is that games should reinvent their formula over time. I think that God of War reinventing its formula was a good thing, right? Now, I know that's probably a hot take. Some people hate Neo God of War combat, but the reality is that God of War 2018 sold like 23 million units. And so the people who, the 5 million people who love the OG God of War combat, who bought the original games, their opinion weighs a lot less compared to the 23 million new people. After God of War switched over, they continued to build on top of that new God of War combat for a while. In a similar way, Eiji Aonuma has already said that they're going to be building on top of Zelda's open air gameplay for the foreseeable future, and they've already done that with Tears of the Kingdom. Resident Evil didn't just take RE4's brand new gameplay style and just say, okay, we're not doing that again. Because at its core, all the RE remakes are built on the kind of core design that was established with RE4, with some pretty significant differences. And it's those differences, though, built on a certain core, makes those games interesting. All of this is to say that it's not necessary to completely reinvent the gameplay style each and every time. In fact, it's a hindrance. I understand that we have very idyllic notions about reinvention and doing things differently and all these sorts of things. When you get into the practicality of creating a thing, you actually realize that a lot of times that hurts a lot more than it helps. I don't think that there is any shame in reuse, in recycling, in taking assets and code and ideas and a foundation and making it even better than before, and making it realize its true potential. How many battle systems out there were the best at their first iteration, right? Like, how many people think that the combat in Demon's Souls, for example, is the best From Software combat? How many people think that KH1's combat is the peak of KH? How many people think the combat in Devil May Cry 1 is the absolute apex of Devil May Cry combat? Most people don't. I would actually go as far as saying the vast majority of the highly praised combat of all time, if you look at it, it is actually not usually the first iteration of that combat. It's usually the multiple iterations after, or at the very least, 1 or 2 iterations after. Usually people praise DMC 3 or 5. Yeah, exactly, right? But DMC 3 and 5 couldn't exist without DMC 1. It's an iteration built off of those DMCs. The idea that each time we can just do something different, not really have any experience on doing it, and it's going to somehow come out good each time. The best analogy I can come up with, being like this athlete and somehow expecting this athlete to somehow be good at every single sport, to the point of where that athlete could play in a major competitive league for each one of those sports. It's like saying, yeah, he's the best at basketball, and in 4 or 5 years later, he's going to be the best at football. In 5 years from that, he's going to be the best at golf. If you are lucky, you get to choose one of those things, and you get to be really, really good at it, of your talent and your life force into it, right? Like, everything you have, if you put it all in there, you get to be exceptional at one thing. Some people, really, really blessed. They can be exceptional at 2 things. All of which is to say, yes, it's good that, it's good to change your gameplay style, but even when you change your gameplay style, you have to stick with the new thing for a while. You have to build on the new thing. You have to believe in the new thing, and also the new thing can't just be the thing that you think is going to sell best or perform the best, or this is what industry trends tell us that we need to make, because in part, AAA games take 7 or 8 years to develop. It's a very long time, and by the time you finish making the thing that you had in mind, or whatever the trend is at the time, when the game comes out, the trend will be completely different. The trend will have already moved on. Like, people will already look at it and think, oh, that's lame now. Also, SE creates whole AAA teams for FF games, then dissolves them after 1 game. IDK any other game developer that works that way. Thank you so much for pointing this out, because this is really important. How can a team continue to get better at their craft if every single time you move them around, if every single time you make a brand new team, a brand new studio to develop the game? Final Fantasy 12, Final Fantasy 13, Final Fantasy 14, 16, 5 different games, 5 different team structures. There has been overlap, yes. Most of the people move around, work on different projects, etc. The key staff will kind of stick together, right? So Yoshi P and Takai or Kitase, but most of the people are moved around entirely, and different people work on all these different projects. How are you supposed to get better at making Final Fantasy games every single time it's a different person making Final Fantasy games? It's a entirely different team. Now, this isn't unwarranted. This isn't just my opinion. Kitase himself has even said one of the biggest reasons that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth only took around 3 years to make. 3 years for a game that big. A game that was so big that earlier we were talking about, in fact, it was too big. That it was so big that it's almost kind of a negative, right? And they were able to do that in 3 years. Kitase says biggest reason for that was because they had a team already in place. They didn't have to onboard new staff. They didn't have to teach new staff to use the engine. They didn't have to, train all of these new people, figure out the team synergy and all these different things. Yeah, it was the same team as Remake. It was the team that was already familiar with the pipeline. It was a team that already knew what they were doing, what the goals were. And of course, yes, they were working with the same engine, and yes, there was asset and code reusage, and that is a huge part of it. And that's also something they should consider as well, for sure. But the big message here, the big message is that they weren't shifting around the teams. They have a Final Fantasy VII team that knew what they were doing. They were able to go immediately to the next game, had an idea of what was wrong with the first game. These were people that were able to look at Remake and said, we had a lot of criticism about the aerial combat in Remake. Well, all the people who worked on it were like, let's come up with a game plan for how we fix aerial combat. And now aerial combat works pretty good in Rebirth, right? So they were able to look at that and build on it because they're the same team. And so it really just boils down to that. There's too many chefs in the kitchen. The Final Fantasy brand is constantly shifting around to different hands and different people. And the other thing is that they don't keep the teams together. We have two Final Fantasy teams at this point. We have CPU 3 and we have CPU 1, or they're known as creative studios now. Keep those creative studios together and keep them making Final Fantasy games. Another thing is that do not make a proprietary engine for one game. Why did we make Final Fantasy 16's engine just for Final Fantasy 16? That's not what Capcom is doing. RE Engine is powering all of Capcom's games, and every single person in Capcom knows how to use RE Engine. This means that they can move these employees around and they'll know what they're doing. If you're working on Final Fantasy 16, CPU 1 needs some help with something, you gotta go learn Unreal. Vice versa, if you're working with Unreal and CPU 3 needs help with something, you need to learn a completely different engine. And you have all of these different engines coexisting under the Square Enix umbrella, where each team is using their own engine. You need to decide, this is the engine that we're using, and then use that engine, and then have all of your employees from top to bottom familiar with that engine. Because again, that is the way that it works most of these AAA companies, but it's something that's not happening with Square. My point is, you have to build on a thing. You can't just, they come in there and they reinvent the entire wheel each time. Metaphor is not built on a new engine. It is built on the Persona 5 engine that Hashino's team is already intimately familiar with, that they made last time, and they're not creating another new engine. I love the idea of this art form taking this randomly different, completely change. How far can we push the form of art? I get it. I get why people love that idea. It's an ideal that can always be pushed, but it's not practical. Persona 3 Reload did use Unreal Engine, yes, but it was also handled by then the same engine. Yeah, SMT5 also used Unreal Engine. Complete reinvention is a good idea for spin-offs and more experimental titles, but for big flagship projects, iteration and learning from a first draft is necessary. Exactly. And that's what Final Fantasy used to do, right? Like, you would have Tactics, and Tactics would be like a spin-off, right? But then whenever you got mainline Final Fantasy again, you kind of knew what to expect. It wasn't wildly out of nowhere. Build on that foundation, keep the team together, use the same engine more than once, it's okay. And yeah, keep that structure together, and if you do all these things, I promise you, Final Fantasy will get back on track.